card game players consider many mechanics present in their favorite games to be unfun in some way. Land destruction, countering spells, discarding cards, bouncing cards back to your hand, tax effects, stacks effects, mutate, at least according to that one guy on Reddit, FTKs, OTKs, PK, actually, scratch that last one, that man is a magic legend and I will not have him slandered on this channel. Uninteractive combos, vanilla play on curve decks, and of course, incessant RNG. I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and I find that most of these unfun paradigms in card games have to do with one thing and one thing exactly: the idea of player agency. Card games are games of decision making. Well, most games are games of decision making, I guess, but card games are pretty much only that. While dexterity, hand-eye coordination, not sure what that gesture is, but I'm sticking with it, hand-eye coordination and reaction time have a lot to do with your ability to play other, especially online titles like CSGO or League of Legends or pretty much any MOBA or FPS. They matter very little in most card games, unless of course you're attempting to run a combo like, say, 4 Horsemen on Modo and not time out. So, in this series, we will examine these various mechanics that are commonly touted as unfun in various card games, and we'll see where exactly the crux of the problem lies and how these mechanics gel with these ideas of decision making and player agency that I said before they are all connected to in some way. I might also suggest some other functions these mechanics serve apart from, being hated by the player base, but I'm not sure that will be possible for all of them because, to be completely honest with you, I also dislike some of them. Thanks a lot for joining me, and let's see what I have in store for you today. Imagine that you've left home on a Friday evening to go play a couple of games at your local game store. There's an event going on that you've been thinking about all day while at work or at school. Maybe there's a couple of boosters to win or some store credit, but you know what, that's secondary. What you're looking forward to the most is testing out your brand new deck, the cards for which came in post earlier this week, including the staple that you've built the whole deck around, Extreme Dragon. And you're confident that if you get to summon Extreme Dragon, your enemies may just as well concede because he's that cool. So you arrive, you shake a couple of hands, high a couple of fives, find your round 1 opponent and sit down to play. You shuffle, the opponent cuts, you draw 7. You look at all the cards, and it's a great hand. Extreme Dragon is in it, and all the other pieces necessary to survive and be able to summon it are also there. The game plan really starts coming together on its own. You just need to play Extreme Dragon's birthday this turn, and then you will be able to play him a turn earlier. You can't do that. Wait, what? What did your extremely deep-voiced opponent just say? You can't do that. The birthday costs 1 more actually. Read my Lathia's effect. He points to his Lathia, Guardian of Barthen. He's right, of course. All your non-creature spells cost 1 more than they would usually do. You take a labored breath. It's not the end of the world. Next turn you can play the birthday and hold up some protection for it. Except Nigel, your opponent's name is Nigel now, plays Tanglewire on his turn, having it up most of your lands. He hits you for 2 with Lathia. You've got 18 more HP, so you can probably wait out Tanglewire. It will go away on its own in a couple of turns. You play a land, but can do little more as most of your lands are tapped due to the Tanglewire. Nigel draws, taps a couple of lands, places a card on the field, and informs you gleefully that your lands no longer untap, except 1. You read through the newly placed Winter Orb, and he's right again, and he hits you for 2 with Lathia. Crap, that means you're not 3 turns away from playing Extreme Dragon, probably more like 7. And the game slows to a crawl. as most of Nigel's attention is focused on stripping you of all resources you have, mounting additional costs for every action you could ever conceive of taking. He hits you for 2 with Lathia. Then he informs you of another reason why you cannot play cards. He hits you for 2 with Lathia. That goes on for some time, and the eventual loss comes as more of a relief than anything, as he hits you for the final 2 with Lathia. Nigel, if that even is his real name, plays a deck that concentrates on making it more difficult for you to do stuff. It might accomplish that through adding additional costs to some of game actions you would normally perform, like playing cards, drawing cards, etc. Maybe presenting you with some hoops that you have to jump through to take these actions, or it may straight up forbid you from taking some of them. In MTG, this type of strategy is often called Stax, after Smokestack, a card that popularized it and indeed was the linchpin of a deck that utilized this type of strategy. You might otherwise know these types of decks as Resource Denial, Prison, or Lockout. Depending on the context, Stax may refer to a specific deck in MTG's vintage format or to the broader playstyle that the deck exemplifies. I will be using the second meaning in today's video, but irrespectively of that, Stax is a strategy that a large portion of the player base absolutely despises playing against. So let's come back to the idea of player agency that I've mentioned in the intro and look at these mechanics from a player agency perspective. One of the more easily understood types of design that constitute Stax design archetypes is forbiddance. These are all the cards that say you can't do X or your opponent may not play cards that X. These lower your agency in a pretty straightforward way. They restrict the number of options you have during a given moment of the match. For example, if you're holding an instant card in MTG, you normally have 3 options: to play it during your turn, your opponent's turn, or not play it at all. But if your opponent has a 3 fairy on the field, your decision space, as it is called, shrinks to either play the instant during my turn or not play it at all. You are losing 1/3 of your options, essentially. This, as it was indeed the case with Teferi, who was quite unpopular when he was playable in Standard, seems especially jarring when it's only your decision space that's being limited, while your opponent can still do whatever they damn well please. This goes against a deeply ingrained expectation of both players having an even playing field during the match. If my opponent can draw cards, I also expect to be able to draw cards. If I can play cards, my opponent should also be able to play cards. Whether we actually do these things, take these actions, depends on the decisions we take, but we should both have the option to take them, if we so please. And of course, there is the logical argument that the opponent sacrificed some resources to cause these changes to the playing field, to play the Teferi, for example. But this does very little to combat that growing internal feeling of unfairness. Designers are aware of that feeling, that's why in many situations there is an attempt at balancing these cards through making them symmetrical, applying to both players and their cards in the same way. And when Stax pieces are balanced as such, their use requires at least a bit of deck building mastery from the user. For example, if a card applies to all creatures, both you and your opponents, you will most likely have to devise some sort of a deck that doesn't really play creatures. Some of them also require additional skill hoops and skill challenges to be passed by the user, like choosing the right moment to play them in order to maximize the damage towards your opponent while also not kneecapping yourself. Even if, in some cases, this is a showcase of true mastery of the game for the user of the Stax piece, we, as the player on the receiving end of the Stax piece, will not really be in the right mind space to really appreciate the degree of mastery and the degree of skill that our opponent put into putting us in this kind of sucky situation. The alternative is Stax pieces that lower the efficacy or efficiency of the cards you play. They lower the impact that your decisions have on the state of the game. Any card that makes your cards weaker, slower, smaller, more expensive, or generally worse in any way will count as part of this design paradigm. They can be just as emotionally jarring as the ones that forbid you from taking actions. There are expectations, unspoken expectations players have that every card play will have a more or less specific effect or range of effects. If I play this card, I am likely to win in the next few turns. If I play this card, my opponent will have to make a difficult decision. These types of expectations. These are formulated both when we add a card to the deck. For example, I am adding this card to my deck because in this matchup, my opponent will have to answer it or lose. Or when formulating the game plan for future turns. For example, if I see this card in my opening 7, I will almost always want to play it on turn 4 because this will greatly increase my chances of winning. So as we formulate these unspoken assumptions and expectations of the type and scale of effect playing a card will have on the outcome of the match, if our opponent requires us, through their actions, to revise these expectations in favor of ones that are objectively worse for us, that will not seem very compelling. There are also Stax pieces that fit somewhere in the middle between these two types of design. For example, having a Thalia or a Lathia on board will lower the resource efficiency of your opponent, making all their instants and sorceries cards more expensive. But if your opponent was planning to play a 2-drop instant or sorcery and you drop a Thalia immediately before that, it will shrink their decision-making space as well. So in some contexts, these efficacy lowering cards will also be treated as an example of forbiddance, but that's of course very context dependent. So in our explanation of the types of design that go into the Stax archetype, let's say, or the Stax type of mechanic, we've touched upon the reasons why they might be viewed as unfun by some players. Let's elaborate on that for a bit. So, as we've mentioned before, you come into the game with expectations of the decision space you will have and the effects of these decisions on your chance of winning. And bear in mind, the expectations about the decision space are not only about decisions that you will have to make, but also the decisions that you will get to make. And what I really mean by that is that you, the player, is looking forward to having to find the optimal play, or the optimal target for a spell, or the optimal sequence. I actually have a video about sequencing, which you can find in the description. The optimal sequence in a sea of suboptimal ones. That's the joy of playing card games. It makes you feel like a skilled player, it makes you feel fulfilled. And when you're stripped of some of that options, and especially when that leads to your loss eventually, you may feel cheated in some way. A similar trend will be felt in expectations of scale. For example, if I manage to play Extreme Dragon, I am likely to win, is a reasonable expectation in a deck that's built around a big payoff card. So when your opponent's strategy allows you to play Extreme Dragon, but also renders it weaker or slower or casts something like passivism on it, that requires you to re-examine that expectation. I did play Extreme Dragon, but I am not likely to win? What's that about? This may be even more painful than playing a match where you just didn't get to cast ED, or didn't draw ED, because contrary to your expectation, you did cast him but you didn't win. As a result, we may fall prey to the Scooby-Doo effect. That's where you look to a single element of the match as the cause of your loss and scream to the rooftops, "I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for that meddling mage!" We may consider all the fun that was not had by us during the match, and we may channel that perceived loss into one very convenient Stax-shaped box, forever emblazoned with the word unfun. Hey, thanks a lot for joining me today. Let me know in the comments if you think Stax pieces are a fun type of design mechanic that allow you to showcase your skill, or maybe if you find them unfun, for the reasons I've mentioned in the video or other ones. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, I would appreciate if you clicked the like button or maybe even the subscribe button, because they really let the algorithm know that the video is worth sharing with more people on YouTube, and that's always appreciated. Thanks a lot again, and I hope to see you in the next one.